My guest today is Merlia Shaukath, founder and CEO of Madhi Foundation, a passionate advocate for equity in education who is on a mission to eliminate India's foundational learning crisis. With degrees from Oxford and the London School of Economics, Merlia has over a decade of experience in the development sector, leading initiatives like Teach for India and consulting for state governments. Under her leadership, Madhi Foundation now impacts over 37,000 schools across 3 states in India, including Tamil Nadu, Nagaland, and Meghalaya. Recognized by prestigious fellowships and as a global finalist for the UK Alumni Award, Merlia is committed to making early childhood education the cornerstone of social equity and change. A very warm welcome to Atlanta Diaries, Merlia, and thank you for partnering in this mission.
Thank you so much, Enma. Thank you so much for having me. Absolute pleasure.
So, love for you to begin with describing your childhood and in what ways do you think it played a role in shaping the person you've become?
So I've never been shy of saying that I come from an extremely privileged background. You know, you look at me on paper and you would say Muslim, and that typically defines a lack of privilege rather than privilege. But I think in my case, I was fortunate to be born into a family that made me feel safe, that gave me the privilege of education. My parents were first generation entrepreneurs who did well for themselves, and they left no stone unturned to give us an extremely comfortable upbringing. So my parents were garment exporters who traveled the world. And growing up, in retrospect, I realized that a lot of my education happened outside the classroom. It very organically, builds that kind of worldview in you when you travel and you're interacting with adults, even at a very early age. So, you start appreciating that cultures look so different everywhere. I went to a very humble school in that sense. It was a really good school, but it drew children from all kinds of backgrounds. Our class was truly diverse in every sense of the word. And I think a lot of your education comes from that as well. So yes, a wonderful childhood, very grateful. And you made me really nostalgic now.
I can resonate with you in so many ways. I've had the, again, privilege of traveling, lived in the East and now in the West and of course India. And I can't emphasize enough how mind expanding it is, right?
Yes.
In fact, I come from, a relatively small city called Chandigarh, and whoever I meet, I tell them, you have to push your kids out of Chandigarh. It's such a cocoon life. So at some level, like you said, it also makes you entitled, right?
It's a bubble.
Yeah, it's a very comfortable bubble, yes. And nobody wants to get out of that bubble, right? So, Malia, let's shift gears a little bit and help me understand what led you to the development sector from get-go.
Sure. So paradoxically, Enma, while I acknowledge that we grew up, with a lot of privilege and a lot of luxuries, we were never allowed to take money for granted. We were always reminded that, whatever we're enjoying is coming out of very hard work. And at that point, yeah, you feel like, but, what if I just want to get, another pencil box? But I would always be told, but you have a good pencil box that's perfectly sturdy and you don't need too many of them, right? So I'm really grateful, again, in hindsight, to my parents for an upbringing like that, because, that kind of clarity and that kind of appreciation only comes when you have kids of your own. And then you realize that, yeah, it's so important to strike that balance, right? And my story is also quite bizarre in the sense that, there was a lot of parental pressure, if you will believe it, to look at the development sector very seriously. Obviously, I don't think development sector or the social sector was sort of in the vocabulary for my parents. But, the one thing that just got repeated at home, especially by my dad to me, was that to whom much is given, much is expected, right? So when you enjoy as many privileges as I did, it's almost incumbent upon someone like us to give back, right? And I think that just stayed with me. So some parents condition their children to pursue engineering, and mine conditioned me to, pursue social work. And I think I sort of also gravitated towards this kind of a life choice and career choice quite naturally. I also had some very powerful teacher influences very early in my life. And I think I promised my fourth standard teacher that when I grow up, I will become a teacher myself. Unfortunately, she's no more, and I feel her loss deeply. But she was the most wonderful teacher, and she just taught with so much love and so much care that you realize at that point that a good teacher really does leave almost a lifelong indelible impression on you, and that's what she did. So I was sort of a teacher's pet. I could say that because I was very academically inclined, not very troublesome, again, very, very nerdy, in that sense. And she would say, you'd make such a good teacher. And the world needs more teachers that teach with love. And even back then, I used to love teaching, even in my fourth grade. Like I would stay back after school and help other friends, with the homework or whatever. I just loved learning so much that I wanted everybody to experience that joy, even if they were my classmates. And I think there were different influences along the way that just strengthened that proclivity for teaching.
So let's shift gears, Malia. Share with us briefly the purpose of Madhi Foundation. I think it already set the stage for our conversation.
Sure. So the purpose, or what really drives us, is our mission to put foundational learning first so every child can thrive. And I think I just want to at this point clarify that we're not saying that every child ought to go to college or that every child needs to become an engineer or a doctor. Education as it is an extremely contentious issue. Everybody has an opinion about what education ought to be and what it ought not to be. So I'm leaving those arguments and debates aside for a minute and saying that the ability to read and comprehend and make sense of the world around you and be numerate is really the most fundamental building block for life. I don't think anyone can argue with that, right? And every time you look at the kind of dysfunction or damage that you would like to undo in later years, especially with children, you would always backtrack and see that it all started in their primary foundational years. So through Madhi, what we really, really like to do is to prevent the damage from happening rather than trying to reverse it once it happens. What we mean by that is the government here is in charge of delivering education, and therefore they're the suppliers. And the parents and the communities are the ones that demand education. And for any sort of education reform at scale or at a systemic level to endure and sustain, you need both the supply and demand forces to come together.
Sure.
You need the government to get its act together. You need them to ensure that they're constantly looking to improve efficiency and efficacy of public education systems. And on the demand side, parents, unfortunately, especially those that send children to public schools, are not empowered to distinguish between good and bad education, or they are not empowered to even ask for better education because they almost feel grateful for the fact that the government is provisioning education, right? And I think that needs to change because at the end of the day, parents need to become allies of the system and play their part in collectively improving the quality of education for children. So that's what Madhi works on. And the hope is that, in our lifetime at least, we see public schools in India become the schools of choice for parents, and not just for low-income parents, for all parents across income groups.
Awesome. And it actually took me to my amazing conversation with Vinita Gursahani. She's actually started this organization called We the People Abhiyan.
Mm-hmm.
The whole purpose of the organization is to help people, citizens of India, understand what citizenry is all about.
Right.
Your fundamental rights, and understand that it's your right and demand it. So more than happy to make an introduction. So that's one thing that stood out for me in this conversation. And from here, I want to talk about the early stages of Madhi. How did the organization evolve? And I'm sure there must be enough challenges given that government body is somebody we can't do without, and it's not easy to deal with them.
Absolutely. I think when you truly start working with the government, you somehow start developing this intense sense of empathy for just how the system navigates itself with many constraints and many challenges. I just wanted to respond to that.
No, but it's interesting to know that, right? Because there's the stereotype we have towards the government. It's good to get that perspective.
Yeah. And you work with good officers, many good officers in the system. So your perception of the government being broken and dysfunctional tends to change quite a bit. So to respond to your question about Madhi's journey, I truly can't believe that it's almost going to be 10 years. And we started with a team of 4 and so that a team of 5. And we started in the spare bedroom that I had in my house. We couldn't even afford an office room back then. And I think I got lucky even then. The founding team, I was pretty much a nobody back then, right? I had worked, of course, with Teach for India and policy consulting gig that I had. We were much younger, of course, so a lot more bravado than I have right now. And we said, we're going to try and change the system, as it were. And we were all aligned that we wanted to solve a problem. And that's something that's actually driven me all along, right? Because I was, like I said, much younger. I was much angry at how the system was failing our children, angry at the fact that it's taking us so long to fix it, and also a lot of impatience. I was not okay with the fact that this was going to take another 50 years to fix, right? So I think very, very fortunate to have worked with a founding team that resonated with that thought. And the fact that they even came into a, absolutely newly minted a nonprofit, took that leap of faith. And these were all just brilliant individuals who could have opted for any opportunity out there. But I was just so grateful that they chose Madhi and really set the bar high for the many other cohorts of team members that would join Madhi.
As an NGO, we are stretched for funds, right? So my question to you is that how did you attract that talent from a talent perspective and from the perspective that you can't shortchange them from wanting to work in the social sector?
Yeah.
And I also believe that people in the social sector work much harder.
Yes.
Bring more passion, bring more purpose to the organization. So how does one strike that balance of, being an NGO, but yet making sure that you're doing justice to all other fronts? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So usually social entrepreneurs who are especially starting up nonprofits have some sort of a social network that they fall back on for different things. Either they come from a background that affords them that network that can very quickly and easily fund them, or allows them other kinds of networks from within the government that kind of, helps them grow very quickly. I had none of that, and therefore nothing on a silver platter there. What did exist is my network with Teach for India, through Teach for India. And Shaheen is one of my my role models. I always tell Shaheen that had there not been Teach for India, I'm not sure if there would have been a Madhi. Because that really was my launch pad. And my 4 founding team members were Teach for India alum. So I drew heavily from that network. And though I was never a fellow, I was a staff at Teach for India. I just, resonated with the mission and the culture at Teach for India. So I think, again, my passion for education came through. So when I did reach out to people when I was building Madhi, they sort of immediately recognized who I was because I had been very vocal about wanting to change the system even back at Teach for India. And two, maybe there was some credibility that they saw in the way I operated even while I was at Teach for India, right? And thankfully, at that point, the whole, concept of incubators and seed funding for nonprofits, it was just coming in. And again, people I had worked at Teach for India with were at this organization called Central Square Foundation. It's, again, doing incredible work in education in India. And CSF was the sort of seed funder, the first funder. And thankfully, they still continue to fund us even to this day. But just looking back, I'm just amazed at how the dots connected, and it just seemed everything at the right time, right place, because had there not been, again, that the whole idea of seed funding for nonprofits picking up, I'm not sure if, again, I would have been able to attract the kind of talent that I did even for a founding team. And that's pretty much how we grew.
So were you clear that a big chunk of the funding is going to go into a certain kind of talent?
I don't think we offered, very competitive salaries when we started off, honestly. So again, the fact that these 4 people chose Madhi is still a mystery to me. We still have our WhatsApp group active, despite it being, almost 10 years now. So I'm like, what madness came upon you guys that you threw everything away? And I think, it's heartening to hear them say, obviously, very, very kind things about why they chose Madhi.
What do they say?
I think to them, it was the vision that resonated. And I always say that there are many battles to fight within education, right? Education isn't one battle. And the fact that this was a battle against poor foundational learning, I think felt very personal to them because all of them had taught in primary schools. And they had seen the kind of difference that strong foundational learning can make and the kind of damage that poor foundational learning can also wreak, right? And also, I think all of them liked the kind of high rigor environment and high rigor culture that I spoke to them about even during the interview, never shied away from saying that, hey, we may be a startup, but we really want to have our systems, processes, ideas in place as much as we can. We're not going to make excuses to say that we're a startup and therefore, it's okay if we don't get it right. Perfectionist is a bad word these days, so I'm trying not to use it. But I think I almost felt a sense of responsibility and duty towards the children that we were committing to working towards, and saying that just because we're an NGO, just because we're a startup, just because we're short on funds, does not mean we deliver substandard quality, right? So I think, again, those are things that I've been told really stood out to that mad group of 4 people that started Madhi with me. And before that, actually, 2. When I said unofficially, we started in 2015. So we had 2 more volunteer their time with us, quite literally. And I do believe that we need people with the biggest hearts and the brightest minds to be working in the social sector. So I think it was important, therefore, to find those people with big hearts and bright minds. And I got lucky.
Awesome.
And I continue to get lucky. I think that continues to drive our people practices and our people policies at Madhi. And we look for culture fitment, I think, more closely than we do for skill, because I think if you can find people who appreciate the culture of learning, the culture of not making peace with substandard quality of work, then you can always upskill and coach them, into any role that you want them to take up. But I don't think you can coach someone into a culture. Either they fit or they don't.
Do you think your leadership style evolved over the years, and what kind of challenges did you navigate as you sort of created your leadership style?
Oh, absolutely. To give you another personal story, for the 10 years of my school, I was somehow always elected the class leader for those 10 years. Looking back, I feel like, school nurtured a very different definition of leadership for me. And this is probably true of many schools in India where, being a school leader is about authority, about, having a sort of status, a weight that you can throw around or, and nobody associate things like empathy and humility and modesty and care with leadership at that age. In school, I don't think I ever was, told that a leader has to be kind. So I think my definition of leadership was, in that sense, very power centered, right? And I think I've come a very long way since then. And that has happened because I've met many, many very powerful leaders, but powerful leaders who've led with a lot of kindness. And I think that's challenged my notion of leadership in so many ways. And therefore, when we started Madhi, we picked out what Madhi's core values would be. And over the last 10 years, they've evolved to a certain extent. But I think one thing that has been a constant is empathy. And I think my understanding of empathy and acceptance of empathy as a big part of my leadership style has also evolved along the way. And I think age also mellows you in so many ways. I think we still operate with that sense of urgency, but in a way to understand that we're running a marathon and not a sprint. And if we don't pace ourselves, then we're likely not going to finish the marathon. So, why run it? So my leadership style, therefore, has changed from being a 100-meter sprinter who's sort of high on energy and, gets that adrenaline going and just wants to finish the race and, to being a lot more of a marathon runner these days. That's the best analogy that I can present.
Any pivotal points which sort of helped you, I think, become intentional?
Sometimes things move so slowly, so gradually, but they're certainly moving, but you don't realize that they're moving until they've moved to a point where you're like, aha, this is pointing in a very different direction these days, So it's been very gradual. And I think my biggest learnings have come from the kind of feedback I've got from my team. I've been very, very almost obsessive about feedback. Sometimes I do tend to take it to heart, but I think that's all part of the learning and the journey. And so the gradual shift in my leadership style has come from just listening to people around me that I know care for me as well as a leader, right? So that would be, my board, my team members, now my co-founders, our funders. And this is something that I tell young people or younger people these days, that don't shy away from feedback, because I see feedback almost being equated with criticism. And yes, not everyone knows how to give you, feedback as well. But look at the spirit in which the feedback is being given. And feedback can literally be a life changer, if you took it in the right spirit and worked on it. I'm also someone who invests a lot in mindful, reflective sort of practices. I've had coaches, I've had therapists, I've had, different mentors. And I love just talking about life journeys and how people perceive me, because sometimes your self-perception can be so distorted. So keeping that balance, also not, getting too drawn down or, getting too self-critical. That's also important. So surrounding yourself with those kind of mentors is the best gift that you can give yourself as a leader.
So talk to us about how did your partner support you in your journey?
Yeah, so that's really funny because I was 22 when, we got married. And even at that point, I said, hey, I want to work in the social sector. And he was like, yeah, social work, you'll have a relaxed life and, we can really have a good time together. And, you should really talk to him today. And he'll be like, I had no idea you guys worked this hard. It's been, one of those really funny twists of fate for him in saying that. But he's also an extremely driven, passionate entrepreneur. So it's not very difficult for him to understand what passion can do to you. It's sort of unstoppable force that you have no control over. So again, he relates to my obsession, and therefore I don't have to explain too much about why I work so hard. It took him a long time to come around to understanding why someone would work so hard for so little money. It wasn't just me, that I had an entire team that was partaking in this madness, right? So that took me a while for me to explain that, some of us are not always driven by money. I mean, it would be nice to have money and, luxury. So the joke is that he makes all the money and I make all the karma. So we balance each other out.
I do want to pick up one more perspective to your personal journey. You did talk about, some difficult pregnancies and some mental health concerns. And you also said that they probably even shaped your perspective on leadership and work at Madhi.
Sure. It is certainly not easy opening up about, mental health, but I think it's becoming easier to talk about it these days because there's a lot more understanding and a lot more sensitivity around it. So yeah, I had my first major mental health breakdown when I was in my late teens, early 20s, again, caused by certain personal circumstances. I was diagnosed with severe clinical depression at that point, and I had to resort to medication. Again, you wouldn't imagine that parents of that generation 17 years ago would believe in, a medical intervention or even believe in mental health breakdown as a serious concern. But they did, and they stood by me and they saw me through it and they saw me on the other side of it. And I wish for everyone who's dealing with mental health concerns to have a strong support system at home, because nothing can heal you as much as that can. That's, again, a privilege that I don't take for granted. So that was my first episode of a breakdown. I've had a few subsequent ones, again, brought on by different personal circumstances and triggers. And I think the most recent one was about 5 years ago, when I had my son. He's our firstborn, and we had him almost 11 years after we got married. And though that was a deliberate choice, right? And it was a very textbook kind of pregnancy. But one fine day when I was 25 weeks pregnant, I had to go into labor and deliver. So he was born almost, in grams, that would be 550 grams. And I think that was one of the darkest times of my life. My dad's demise was the other before that. But But this really shook my core because, I didn't know what I was going to deal with. Uncertainty really unnerves me. And I had my life planned out and, sorted. We were very deliberate about when we would have children and, how that would play out. And here it was, everything sort of, turned upside down. And I had to resort to therapy, to medication to get through it. And thankfully, we have a very healthy and very naughty 5-year-old today. And obviously, when you're going through it, the first question you ask is, why me? And why me so many times? Again, this is intensely personal, but if this can help women out there, I don't mind sharing it. I also went through a pregnancy loss last year, and that was incredibly difficult to deal with as well. But if I really have to look at it as a life lesson, I think it's made me obviously stronger mentally because, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger and all of that. But as an individual, but as a leader, it certainly has made me a lot more sensitive and empathetic about mental health. Again, ironically, I am extremely sensitive about mental health, but I'm also confused about how mental health is getting oversimplified these days. To kind of define or diagnose everything as a mental health disorder or a mental health breakdown is what confuses me. I don't want to come across as somebody who's, judgmental about the fact that, hey, but not everything is a mental health issue. But there is a certain science behind it, right? I mean, you wouldn't go ahead and self-diagnose diabetes, right? There are some markers, there are some indicators, there are some parameters to say that, hey, you have diabetes. Social media, I think, contributes a lot to confusing young people about what is a mental health disorder and what is a sort of off mood, especially for women. We have so many hormones sort of interplaying in our bodies that it's sometimes very confusing to even to us to kind of identify whether this is a mental health breakdown or is it just a sort of a hormonally triggered mood change. I definitely think that mental health issues need very, very serious attention and, it has to form a part of our workplace policy. Managers have to be sensitized towards it. But I think it's also the responsibility of team members to own their mental health.
Like your physical health is.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. To place the onus of your mental health on, say, your manager entirely or your organization entirely and saying that they're causing me a mental health breakdown. In some cases, yes, workplaces can be extremely toxic and abusive and, we have to call them out. But not every instance of, say, critical feedback cannot be attributed to a mental health breakdown right away, right? So I think we have to be sensitive in how we frame these dialogues and discourses on mental health because it's very, very important, especially because more and more young people are coming to understand what it is. And therefore, we have to be extremely responsible about it.
That's a great perspective, Malia. At some level, the minute it's a mental health concern, the organization gets worried.
Yeah.
And almost like they take responsibility of it. And the other school of thought is that, the only person who can put you under stress is you.
Yeah.
Which basically what you're saying that, take control, build those, mental fitness muscles, build that strength like you would do it for a physical. I do want to double click on the mental health policies you spoke about. So what does mental health mean in Madhi from a policy perspective?
Yeah. So like I said, right, there are said and unsaid policies. Of course, the said policies are, you're allowed to take health leaves, and it doesn't matter whether it's physical health or mental health. We never double down on anybody who says, I want a day off because I'm feeling mentally unwell or that I just don't have the energy to work. But there are other softer aspects of working with a team. For example, we have something called a monthly check-in, and sometimes those are fortnightly check-ins as well. And some of the questions there are very deliberately towards checking in on the team members' mental health. And what have you invested in towards your mental health? And how can I, as a manager, support you towards your mental health journey in case there is a struggle at the moment? So those are softer aspects of your organizational culture that just gets woven in very, very organically. Yes, there is a structured questionnaire that you follow, but over a period of time, these become very normal questions to ask by a manager to a team member, right? We have, our step backs that happen every quarter, and these are also team spaces where we talk a lot about work-life harmony, work-life balance, what it means, and we've in fact asked every team member to define what work-life balance means to them, 3 or 4 non-negotiables, and to let their manager know, and the manager has to respect those boundaries. So some might say that, I want to be home for dinner with my family every day at 7. And we ensure that that is respected, because work-life balance may mean so many things to so many people. For me, work-life balance is, working 12 hours, and I feel perfectly balanced doing that. But just because I draw my sense of, balance from that does not mean that I expect everybody else to work 12 hours a day either, right? And that's something that as leaders, we kind of reiterate in several conversations. And I think you can have a million policies written down, but if you are not walking the talk as leaders and obviously showing through action that you really mean it when you say that mental health matters, no one's going to take your policy seriously, right? So we do not question when somebody wants to go on personal vacation. We have a very, very healthy leave policy. We have other things like downtime during Christmas to New Year. The entire organization shuts down. And we have a space called Unplugged, which we host again once in 6 weeks, where one of the 3 founders leads session on topics like this that are completely unconnected to work, but talk about the other personal, emotional aspects of bringing your authentic self to work. So different spaces, but all sort of reinforcing the same message that we acknowledge mental health is important. And while it may not be that we're taking the entire responsibility for it, we're happy to share it with you. And in this case, I want to call out the fact that our board has been a big advocate of ensuring work-life balance is not just we're not just paying lip service to it. They've constantly asked us to take breaks. They ask us if we exhaust our mandated leaves, and they push us to do it. And I think that trickles down, right? I don't think we're perfect yet. We do have very, very tight deadlines still. We're still understaffed. Unfortunately, again, comes back to the whole conversation around being underfunded and all of that. But at the same time, I don't think we're making an excuse. Our intent is 100% there.
Yeah.
But we'll keep trying to get better at it.
So let's shift gears, Malia. What do you think are the key factors behind this phenomenal growth in these years?
I think when you're working with a large, complex system such as the public education system, what really is the secret sauce is consensus building. End of the day, what we're trying to do here is not deliver a program, but to change behaviors. Mindsets and behavior, right? And that doesn't happen in a year or two. It requires immense patience, and it requires a lot of patient capital. I will spare no chance to call that out. So if you are really in, for the lack of a better word, business of behavior change, then you have to, of course, leverage technology as much as you can, because technology can provide those, nudges that can eventually lead to behavior change. But you must, I think, invest in consensus building. It takes time. It's painful. It sometimes feels like you're going nowhere with it. But for change to endure, and I guess even in our case, it is that has really set us apart from others who tend to come in with a ready solution and saying that we have this, a bureaucrat at the top or an IS officer has signed off on it. We're just going to, implement it in all schools. We don't do that. In fact, through our about 5 years of working with the system, at every instance, there has been feedback that we have collected from 80,000 teachers. Of course, using technology, and that's possible today. Send out forms and get them to give you feedback. But listening to that feedback and taking it seriously and acting on it and constantly iterating on the design and giving them the confidence and faith that the system is listening to you. We're not dismissing your pain points. We're not saying you're lazy. And especially when it comes to teachers, we acknowledge that there are very real issues at play. And for them to see that their feedback has not only been taken, but also adopted, and it reflects in how programs get redesigned, is where you build consensus and build trust. So building trust, building consensus works disproportionately more than building good technology when it comes to working with public systems.
So before we end, Merlia, share with me a success story or, some impact story because of which obviously this passion stays.
Yeah, I can obviously cite numbers and saying that, because of the work that we do, children have grown X%. But there's a lovely little anecdote that inspires me every day. And this is something that I go back to get me out of bed on those rough days. So very early in Madhi's journey, we had just concluded a teacher training session. And a teacher walked up to us at the end of it and she said, I was just going to submit my voluntary retirement application the next week because I had completely lost my love for the teaching profession and I was feeling a little jaded. But your training has invigorated or inspired me so much that I am not going to do it. In fact, I'm going to withdraw my resignation. And she actually saw that through in the sense that she continued working for the next 4 years of her teaching service, continues to be in touch even today, and is always a huge well-wisher on social media. But I think the fact that we could touch even one teacher and reignite that love and reignite that excitement for teaching meant so much and continues to mean so much to me.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Merlia. This was great. And thank you for sharing your journey so candidly. It means a lot.
Thank you so much, Enma. I absolutely enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, do hang on for just one more minute. I have a request for you. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Atlanta Diaries on Spotify, iTunes, or whichever platform you follow. Do join us in our mission to empower and inspire by sharing the podcast with a friend or colleague. It will be great if you can share on the social media platforms you follow, be it LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or any other. Please leave a review or rating on iTunes or Spotify. It really helps us reach a wider audience. Lastly, I wanted to share with you that many of my coaching clients and listeners have created a cheat sheet with their key takeaways from the episodes. I invite you to consider jotting down 1 or 2 key takeaways as you navigate your amazing journey. Have a wonderful rest of the day and see you next week for another inspiring journey on Atlanta Diaries.